Part 1. The Vault Beneath the Dead World. The planet Velthrix had been dead for 50,000 years when Dr. Amara Chun stepped onto its surface for the first time. She stood at the edge of a massive crater and looked down at the entrance to the archive, a structure carved deep into the bedrock by hands that had turned to dust long before humanity learned to make fire. Behind her, the shuttle's engines hummed as it cooled in the thin atmosphere, and beside her stood Dexoral, a being made of living crystal whose body caught the pale sunlight and scattered it into rainbow fragments. 300 years, Dexoral said, and the words came out as music, each syllable a different tone that Amara's translator rendered into flat human speech. 300 years the Conclave has studied this place, and we are no closer to understanding it than when we began. Amara said nothing, and instead she began walking down the Vire path toward the archive entrance. The Conclave of Unified Species was the oldest political body in the known galaxy, and it represented 12 spacefaring civilizations that had achieved faster than light travel and had learned to live together in something like peace humanity. I joined the Conclave only 15 years ago. They were the youngest species by far, and most of the Conclave members still thought of humans as clever animals who had somehow stumbled into space. Before they were ready, Amara knew this, and she did not care. She had spent her entire career studying dead civilizations on Earth, digging through the ruins of peoples who had vanished long before written history. And she had learned that the youngest voice in the room often saw things the oldest voices had forgotten. How to see the archive entrance was a perfect circle, cut into the stone, and as Amara passed through it, she felt the temperature drop by 20 degrees inside. The walls glowed with a soft blue light that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The corridor stretched downward for nearly a kilometer, and at its end lay the central chamber where the tablets waited. Amara had seen images of the tablets before, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of them. 10,000 crystalline slabs stood in rows that stretched from one end of the chamber to the other, each one roughly the size of a human torso, each one covered in patterns that looked like writing but followed no rules that any linguist had ever been able to identify. Every translation matrix we have developed has failed, Dexoral said as they walked between the rows. Every quantum linguistic algorithm returns only chaos, and 17 of our finest Zan linguists have lost their sanity trying to find meaning in these patterns. Amara stopped walking. She reached out and touched the nearest tablet, and the crystal was cold beneath her fingers, colder than the air around it, as if it held some ancient chill that refused to fade. "What do you feel?" Dexoral asked. "Pain," Amara said quietly. "This thing has suffered." Dexoral made a sound that the translator rendered as confusion. "It is a crystal," the being said. "Crystals do not suffer." Amara did not answer, and instead she began to walk through the archive slowly, not scanning, not analyzing, just looking. She ran her fingers along tablet after tablet, and she felt the variations in their surfaces, the tiny ridges and valleys that the Conclave's scanners had mapped in perfect detail, but had never understood. She spent the entire first day doing nothing but walking and touching and listening to the silence of the dead world around her. The Conclave researchers watched her with something between curiosity and contempt. This was the human expert they had been promised, and she was wandering around like a child in a museum, touching things she did not understand. On the second day, Amara sat cross-legged before a cluster of tablets in the archive center, and she closed her eyes. She stayed that way for 6 hours. Dexoral came to check on her several times, and each time the crystalline being found her in exactly the same position, breathing slowly, her face peaceful as if she were sleeping with her eyes open. Finally, as the artificial lights in the archive began to dim for the evening cycle, Amara laughed. It was a small laugh at first, barely more than a breath, but it grew until it echoed off the walls and filled the chamber with a sound that had not been heard there for 50,000 years. "You've been trying to read these as language," she said to Dexerol when the being came rushing over. "They're not language." "Then what are they?" Dexerol demanded. And for the first time, there was something like urgency in the being's musical voice. Amara stood up, and she placed both hands flat against the nearest tablet. "Scars," she said. "These are scars, and you've been trying to read them like words, but scars don't work that way." She turned to face Dexerol, and her eyes were bright with the kind of excitement that only comes when a lifetime of training suddenly finds its purpose. "On my world," she said, "there was a people called the Maori who covered their faces with tattoos, and each tattoo told a story. But the story wasn't in the shape of the tattoo. It was in the process of making it, the pain of it, the healing of it, the way the skin remembered what had been done to it." She gestured at the tablets around them. "These crystals aren't covered in writing. They're covered in damage, deliberate damage, structured damage. Damage that was inflicted over time in specific patterns that meant something to the beings who made them." Dexerol's facets flickered rapidly, a sign of deep processing. "You were saying the precursors did not write their history," the being said slowly. "They wounded it into existence." "Yes," Amara said. "And my species knows something about wounds, and we know something about survival, and we know that sometimes the only way to tell a story is to show the scars." She turned back to the tablets, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "These aren't records of what the precursors knew," she said. "They're records of what the precursors survived, and that's why you couldn't read them. Because none of you know what it means to survive." The archive seemed to grow darker around them, as if the ancient structure itself was listening. "But humans do," Amara said. "We've been surviving against impossible odds since before we came down from the trees, and if anyone can read these tablets, it's us." She smiled, and it was not a happy smile, but the fierce expression of someone who has finally found a battle worth fighting. "Get me a team," she said to Dexerol. "Not linguists, not scientists. Get me historians and doctors and grandmothers. Get me people who know what it means to carry trauma in their bones." She looked around at the 10,000 tablets waiting in the darkness. "And then we're going to listen to what these scars have to say." The conclave assembly chamber was the largest enclosed space. Amara had ever seen it stretch for kilometers in every direction, and the ceiling was so high that clouds actually formed near the top. Tiny wisps of moisture that drifted through the artificial atmosphere like lost dots. Representatives from all 12 conclave species sat in their designated sections, and they watched as Amara walked to the central platform with a single tablet cradled in her arms. Thex Oral had argued against this presentation. The crystalline being had warned Amara that the conclave would not accept her theory, that they would see it as the rambling of a primitive species trying to seem important. But Amara had insisted they need to understand, she had told Dexerol. Not just believe me, but understand why this works and why only humans can do it. Now she stood before the assembled might of galactic civilization, and she felt very small and very young and very human. "For 300 years, she began, the greatest minds in the conclave have tried to decode the archive of Velthrix, and may have failed because they were asking the wrong question." A ripple of displeasure moved through the chamber, and Amara could feel the weight of ancient eyes turning toward her with skepticism and irritation. "You were asking, what do these tablets say?" she continued. "But that is not the right question, because the tablets do not say anything. They do not speak. They scream." She held up the tablet she had brought as she projected its surface onto the massive display screens that floated throughout the chamber. "Look at this pattern," she said. "Your scanners have mapped every microscopic feature of this surface, and your algorithms have tried to find linguistic structures in the arrangement of the fractures and ridges. But there is no linguistic structure here, because this is not writing. She zoomed in on a particular cluster of damage. This is a burn scar, she said. And this next to it is a pressure fracture, and this below is radiation damage, and they did not happen at the same time. They happened in sequence, one after another, over a period of what I estimate to be several hours. The chamber had gone quiet, and even the most skeptical representatives were leaning forward to see. Someone carried this tablet through a catastrophe. Amara said, first there was fire, then there was decompression, then there was radiation. And whoever carried it kept going through all of it because saving this tablet mattered more to them than their own survival. A being from the Methane Collective, a swirling mass of gas contained in a magnetic field, spoke up. How can you possibly determine this sequence from the damage patterns? It asked. Our analysis showed no temporal markers. Amara smiled, and it was a sad smile full of old knowledge. My grandmother, she said, carried her mother's photographs through a burning building when she was 16 years old. There was a war on my world, one of many wars, and the soldiers came to her village and set fire to everything. The chamber was utterly silent now. She ran through the flames with those photographs pressed against her chest, and then she ran through the snow for 3 days until she reached safety. And the photographs were damaged, burned at the edges, water stained from her sweat and tears, creased from being pressed against her body. Amara touched the tablet gently. I grew up looking at those photographs, and I learned to read the story of her survival in every bit of damage. The order of the burns and the stains and the creases told me what she had been through better than any words could have. She looked out at the assembled representatives. My species has been surviving catastrophes for 200,000 years, and we have learned to read the language of damage because we had no choice. It was learn or die, and we learned. She set the tablet down on the platform. The precursors did not write their history in symbols because symbols can be forgotten. Languages can be lost, but damage is universal. Suffering is universal, and any species that has known true catastrophe can learn to read the scars that catastrophe leaves behind. The conclave erupted into noise as representatives argued with each other in a dozen different languages and communication methods. Amara waited finally. A being from the oldest species in the conclave, a creature of pure energy that existed partially outside normal spacetime, spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. You are claiming, it said, that the precursors deliberately encoded their knowledge in trauma patterns because they believed that only a species that had suffered greatly would be worthy of receiving it. No, Amara said. I am claiming something simpler than that. I am claiming that the precursors were dying, and they did not have time to create a formal record. So they did what all beings do when they are dying. They held on to what mattered most, and they let the process of holding on become the record itself. She picked up the tablet again. This is not a message, she said. This is a survivor, and I am asking your permission to assemble a team of humans who know how to listen to survivors. The energy being pulsed with something that might have been. Consideration, what kind of team? It asked. Not linguists. Amara said, not scientists. I need a Holocaust historian who has spent her life studying how trauma passes from generation to generation. I need a trauma surgeon who knows how wounds heal and what scars mean. I need a volcanologist who has studied how civilizations respond to natural disasters. She paused, and I need grandmother from the Pacific Islands whose people have kept alive the memory of ancient tsunamis through oral tradition for thousands of years because she knows something that all your technology cannot teach you. What is that? The energy being asked. She knows how to remember, Amara said. Not with data or recordings, but with her body and her voice and her heart. And that is what the precursors were counting on. That someday, a species would come along that knew how to remember with something other than machines. The vote took 3 days in the end. The conclave approved Amara's request by a narrow margin, and the decision was made more out of desperation than belief. 300 years of failure had made them willing to try anything, even trusting the youngest and strangest species in the galaxy with the greatest mystery of all time. Amara sent out her calls, and one by one her team assembled on Velthrixter Sarah Goldstein, whose grandparents had survived the death camps of Earth's darkest century, and who had devoted her life to understanding how that survival had shaped the generations that followed. Dr. Yusuf Okonkwo, a trauma surgeon from Lagos, who had spent 30 years putting broken bodies back together, and who had learned that every scar told a story. If you knew how to listen. Dr. Carlos Reyes, a volcanologist who had studied the collapse of civilizations around the Pacific Ring of Fire, and who understood that destruction and creation were two faces of the same process. And Mona Topa, an 80-year-old woman from a tiny island in the Pacific who had never been to space before, but who carried in her memory the songs and stories of her people going back 3,000 years. They stood together in the archive, and they looked at the 10,000 tablets waiting in the darkness. "Well," said Dr. Goldstein quietly, "shall we begin?" And they did. 3 months into their work, the team had mapped the damage patterns of over 2,000 tablets, and what they found changed everything the conclave thought they knew about the precursors. They didn't just die, Dr. Goldstein said during one of their evening meetings. They fought back. The team had gathered in a small room, carved into the rock near the archive entrance, and they sat on simple chairs around a table covered with holographic projections of tablet surfaces. "What do you mean?" asked Exeral, who had become a permanent observer of their work. Fascinated despite being unable to fully understand their methods, Dr. Goldstein pulled up a projection of a tablet they had cataloged the day before. "Look at this damage sequence," she said. "First we have impact trauma. Something hit this tablet hard enough to crack it. Then we have evidence that someone gathered the pieces and pressed them back together while they were still hot from the impact. Then we have a completely different type of damage. Precise cuts made with some kind of tool." She traced the patterns with her finger. This tablet was broken in what looks like an attack. Then someone rescued it and put it back together. Then later someone deliberately modified it, added new damage patterns on top of the old ones. Dr. Okonkwo nodded. "I see the same thing in human survivors," he said. "First there is the original wound, then there is the healing. Then there is the way the survivor incorporates the scar into their identity, making it part of who they are rather than just something that happened to them." Mona Topa, who rarely spoke during these meetings, but who saw more than anyone else, raised her hand. "May I show you something?" she asked. Amara nodded, and the old woman stood up slowly and walked to the projection. "In my islands," she said, "we have a practice called tapa. We make cloth from bark, and we beat it and we dye it, and we create patterns that tell the stories of our families." She pointed to a section of the tablet. "This here," she said. "This is not just damage. This is intention. Someone took this broken thing, and they made it beautiful again. They turned the cracks into a design." She looked around at the team. "On my world, we call this kind of thing kintsugi. It is a Japanese word, but we have our own version. It means to repair broken things with gold. To make the breaking part of the beauty." Dr. Reyes, the volcanologist, suddenly sat up straight. "That's it," he said. "That's what we've been missing." He pulled up a map of the archive, showing the positions of all 10,000 tablets. "We've been treating each tablet as an individual record," he said. "But what if they're not individual? What if they're connected? What if the damage patterns on each tablet are meant to be read in relation to the damage patterns on the tablets around it?" began overlaying the damage. Sequences they had cataloged, and slowly a picture emerged. "The tablets aren't random," he said, his voice rising with excitement. "They're arranged in a specific configuration. The severe damage is concentrated here." He pointed to one area of the map, and it spreads outward in waves, like ripples from a stone thrown into water. Amara stood up and walked to the projection, or like the spread of a disaster. She said quietly, "First the epicenter is hit, then the damage spreads to the surrounding areas. Then to the areas beyond that." She turned to face the team. "They're not just recording what happened to them," she said. "They're mapping it, showing us how the catastrophe moved through their civilization, where it started, how it spread, how fast it traveled." The team worked through the night, and by morning they had a preliminary map of the precursor extinction event. It had begun in a region of space that the Conclave had long avoided, a zone of unstable stars and violent radiation that no known species had successfully navigated. From there, it had spread outward, consuming world after world, system after system, until nothing was left except the archive and the dead planet that housed it. But here's the strange thing, Dr. Goldstein said as they reviewed their findings. "The damage patterns don't just show destruction. They show response." She pointed to a series of tablets near the outer edge of the archive. These tablets show damage from the catastrophe, but they also show damage from travel, from being moved rapidly from place to place. And then they show damage from being deliberately modified, just like the one Mona identified. She looked at Amara. "The precursors weren't just dying," she said. "They were trying to survive, and they were documenting their survival attempts in real time, writing it into the tablets as they went." Dr. Okonkwo pulled up another tablet. "Look at this one," he said. "The damage pattern here is unlike anything we've seen. It's almost defensive, like someone used this tablet as a shield." He traced the fracture lines. "See how the cracks radiate outward from the central point? That's an impact pattern. Something hit this tablet hard while someone was holding it in front of them. They were protecting themselves." Amara said. "No," Dr. Okonkwo said. "They were protecting something else. Look at the angle. Whoever was holding this tablet wasn't standing upright. They were crouched over something, covering it with their body and the tablet." Mona Topa made a soft sound. "A child," she said. "They were protecting a child." The room fell. Silent Amara walked to the tablet projection, and she studied the damage patterns for a long moment. The precursors weren't just recording their extinction, she said finally. They were recording their refusal to accept it. Every tablet that shows repair, every tablet that shows defensive damage, every tablet that shows signs of deliberate modification. Those are acts of resistance. She turned to face the Xaro. "Your species and the others in the Conclave have lived in peace and stability for millions of years," she said. "You've never faced extinction, never known what it means to watch your civilization crumble around you. So you couldn't read these tablets because you couldn't understand what they were saying." She gestured at the map of the archive. "They're saying we refused to die. They're saying we fought back with everything we had. They're saying that even at the end, when there was no hope left, we kept going because that's what survivors do." The Xerals. Crystalline form chimed with something that the translator could not render into words. "Continue your work." The being said finally, "I believe you are closer to the truth than anyone has been in 300 years." Amara nodded, and she turned back to her team. "Let's keep mapping," she said. "I have a feeling the real message is still waiting for us somewhere in all this damage." And she was right. The breakthrough came 6 months into the project. On a night when Amara could not sleep, she had been walking through the archive alone, something she did often when her mind was too full of questions to rest. And she had stopped in front of a cluster of tablets near the very center of the chamber. These central tablets had always puzzled her. were the most damaged of all the tablets in the archive, covered in layer upon layer of fractures and scars that overlapped so completely it was almost impossible to separate one damage event from another. But as Amara stood there in the darkness, looking at the tablets from a slightly different angle than usual, she suddenly saw something she had never noticed before. The tablets were not just damaged, they were arranged. She ran back to the team's quarters and woke everyone up, and within an hour they were all standing in the archive with portable lights and scanning equipment. "Look at the spacing," Amara said, pointing at the central tablets. "It's not random. There's a pattern here. A three-dimensional pattern." Dr. Reyes was the first to understand. "Stars," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're arranged like stars." He pulled out his personal computer and began running calculations. "The spacing matches known stellar configurations," he said. "Not exactly, but close enough that it can't be coincidence. These tablets are arranged to represent a star map." Dr. Goldstein walked slowly around the central cluster. "But why would they hide a star map in the arrangement of the tablets?" she asked. "Why not just include it in the damage patterns like everything else?" Monotopa answered. "Because a star map is not a memory," she said. "It is a direction. It tells you where to go. And directions must be hidden from those who would use them." "Wrongly," Amara nodded. "The precursors knew that someday someone would come to this archive," she said. "They knew that whoever came would try to decode the tablets, and they wanted to make sure that only the right people would find the real message." She gestured at the three-dimensional arrangement of the central tablets. "If you try to read the tablets as text, you never notice the arrangement. You focus on the individual patterns and you miss the bigger picture. But if you understand that the tablets are testimony, that they're records of survival rather than records of information, then you start to see the whole archive differently." Dr. Okonkwo had been scanning the arrangement, and now he looked up with an expression of shock. "The star map points to a specific location," he said. "A region of space in the unstable zone. The same zone where the catastrophe originated." The team exchanged glances. Why would they want to send us back to the place that destroyed them? Dr. Goldstein asked. Amara walked to the very center of the tablet cluster, to the single tablet that occupied the heart of the arrangement. This tablet was different from all the others. It had been damaged more severely than any tablet in the archive. Burned and frozen and irradiated and shattered so many times that its surface had become almost smooth. The countless fractures worn away by what could only be described as handling. Countless hands over countless years had touched this tablet, passed it down, added their own damage to its already devastating wounds. "This one has been touched by thousands of beings," Amara said softly. "Maybe millions across generations. It's the most broken thing in this entire archive." She picked it up carefully and held it to the light. The tablet was surprisingly light, as if all the damage it had suffered had somehow made it less substantial. Or maybe as if the beings who had carried it had worn it thin with their desperate grip. "It's a key," Amara said. "A key to what?" Dexoral asked. Amara turned the tablet over in her hands, and she noticed something she had not seen before on the underside. Protected from most of the damage by the way the tablet had been held and stored over the millennia, there was a small depression, perfectly circular, about the size of a human thumb. "Someone pressed something here," she said, "over and over for thousands of years. They pressed something into this spot until they wore a groove into the crystal." She looked at the star map arrangement around her. "The catastrophe started in the unstable zone," she said. "The precursors couldn't stop it, couldn't even slow it down. It destroyed everything they had built over millions of years." She held up the key tablet. "But they didn't just give up. They created this archive. They encoded their testimony into damage patterns that would require a species of survivors to read. And they left a star map hidden in the arrangement of the tablets. She took a deep breath. They're sending us back to the source, she said. Not because they want us to face the same catastrophe, but because they left something there, something they saved from the destruction. Something important enough that they spent their dying days building this entire archive to point the way to it. Dr. Goldstein looked at the key tablet. What could be worth all of this? She asked. What could be so important that they would create this incredible puzzle just to lead someone to it? Mona Topa spoke quietly. Hope, she said. When my people faced the great waves that destroyed our islands long ago, the survivors did not save gold or jewels. They saved seeds and stories. They saved the things that would let the next generation begin again. She looked at Amara. The precursors were not just recording their death, she said. They were planting something for the future. Something they believed was worth dying to protect. Amara nodded. We need to go to the unstable zone, she said. We need to find what they left behind. Dexrol's crystalline form flickered with concern. The unstable zone is deadly. The being said, no conclave species has ever successfully navigated it. The radiation alone would destroy any ship we possess. Amara smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for a moment she never knew was coming. No conclave species, she said. But humans are different. She looked at her team. We evolved on a world that tried to kill us every day. We survived ice ages and supervolcanoes and plagues and wars. Our bodies are built to endure radiation and extreme temperatures and pressure changes. That would kill any other known species. She turned back to Dexaro. The precursors knew this, she said. They chose their damage pattern specifically because they knew that someday a species like us would come along. A species tough enough and broken enough to read their message and follow it to the source. She held up the key tablet. They built this whole archive for us, she said. And now it's time for us to finish what they started. The ship that carried the human team into the unstable zone was called the Persistency. Was a small vessel, built specifically for this mission, with radiation shielding 10 times thicker than any conclave ship and life. Support systems designed to keep its human crew alive in conditions that would kill any other known species. The journey took 3 weeks, 3 weeks of violent radiation storms and gravitational anomalies that would have torn a normal ship apart. 3 weeks of the crew taking turns in the medical bay as their bodies fought against the invisible assault of cosmic rays. 3 weeks of Amara clutching the key tablet and wondering if she had led her team to their deaths. But they survived. Humans always survived on the 22nd day. They reached the heart of the unstable zone, and they found something impossible as structure, ancient beyond measure. Floating in a pocket of relative calm at the center of the chaos, it was built from the same crystalline material as the tablets, and it glowed with a soft blue light that Amara recognized immediately. It's an archive, she breathed. Another archive, but as they approached, she realized she was wrong. This was not an archive of tablets. This was something else entirely. Structure was honeycombed with millions of tiny chambers, each one containing a small crystalline container. And when Amara scanned the containers, she found something that made her heart stop. Genetic material. The structure was a seed vault, a repository of DNA from thousands of different species, preserved in crystalline matrices that had somehow survived 50,000 years in the deadliest region of space. They saved everyone, Dr. Goldstein whispered. Every species they ever encountered. They saved the genetic templates. Dr. Okonkwo was scanning the containers with trembling hands. There are patterns here I don't recognize, he said. Species that must have gone extinct long before the precursors themselves died. He looked up at Amara. And there are patterns I do recognize, he said. Human patterns. Amara walked to the section he indicated, and she looked at the containers stored there. were smaller than the others, more fragile, and they bore damage patterns that she could read as easily as she could read her own name. These containers had been added late. Very late, when the precursors were already dying. Someone had made a special trip, a dangerous journey through the same unstable zone that had nearly killed the Persistence crew. Just to add these tiny containers to the vault. They found us, Amara said softly. 50,000 years ago, when we were still hunting on the African plains. They found us and they took samples of our genetic material. She touched one of the containers gently. They saw something in us, she said. Even then, when we were just clever animals with stone tools. They saw something worth saving. Monatopa had wandered to a different section of the vault, and now she called out. Come here, she said. You need to see this. The team gathered around her, and they saw what she had found, a small chamber, separate from all the others, containing a single tablet. It was the most damaged tablet any of them had ever seen. Even more damaged than the key tablet from the archive. And its surface had been worn so smooth by handling that it almost looked like glass, but there was one mark on it that was still visible. One impression that had somehow survived all the damage, a handprint. A small handprint, the size of a child's. Someone pressed a child's hand against this crystal, Mona said. And there were tears running down her weathered face. At the end of everything, when their whole civilization was dying, someone took a child's hand and pressed it against this tablet. Amara reached out and placed her own hand over the hand printed, was smaller than her palm, the fingers barely reaching her first knuckles. And as she touched it, she felt something she had never felt before, connection across 50,000 years of empty space. Across the death of a civilization and the rise of 100 others. She was touching the same crystal that a dying precursor had used to preserve the memory of a child. This is the message, she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. This is what they wanted us to find. Not the genetic material, not the vault. This, she held up the tablet with the tiny handprint. They wanted us to know that at the end, when there was nothing left to save, they saved the children. They made sure that even if they died, the next generation would have a chance. Dr. Goldstein was crying too. That's why they needed a species of survivors to find this, she said, because only survivors would understand. Only people who had lost everything and kept going would know what it meant to press a child's hand against a crystal and call it hope. The team stood in silence for a long moment, surrounded by the preserved genetic legacy of 1,000 species, looking at the handprint of a child who had lived and died before humanity took its first steps out of Africa. Then Amara spoke. We need to take this back, she said. All of it, the vault, the tablets, the handprint. We need to take it back and show the conclave what we found. She looked at her team. We need to show them what survival really means. The journey back was easier than the journey in, as if the unstable zone itself recognized what they carried and chose to let them pass when they reached Velthrix. The conclave was waiting. Thexerol was the first to greet them, and the crystalline being's facets were flickering with an emotion that the translator rendered simply as awe. You survived, Thexerol said. We did, Amara said. And we brought back something important. She presented the seed vault's contents to the conclave, explaining what the precursors had preserved and why. But when she came to the final tablet, the one with the child's handprint, she did not explain. She simply held it up for everyone to see. The precursors left us a message, she said. It took us 300 years to read it, and it took my team 6 months to understand it. But here it is. She placed the tablet on the central platform. The message is the breaking, she said. The precursors wanted us to understand that survival is not about being unbroken. It is about shattering and coming back together differently. It is about turning your scars into maps for the people who come after. She looked at Thexerol. You asked me once how humans could read these tablets when no other species could. she said. "And I told you it was because we knew how to survive." She touched the tiny handprint. "But that's not quite right," she said. "We can read these tablets because every human alive is descended from someone who should have died and didn't. We are the impossible survival of our ancestors. We carry their trauma in our bones and their hope in our hearts." She looked down at the assembled representatives of 12 spacefaring civilizations, beings of crystal and gas and energy and flesh, all of them watching her with something that might have been understanding. "The precursors didn't choose us because we were strong," she said. "They chose us because we were broken, because we had been shattered so many times that we had learned to find beauty in the cracks." She picked up the tablet with the child's handprint, and she held it against her chest. "This is what they wanted us to know," she said. "This is what they died to tell us." She looked at the tiny handprint one more time. "That even at the end of everything, when all hope is gone and the darkness is closing in, you press a child's hand against the crystal and you say, 'We were here, we hurt. We survived long enough to save you.'" She smiled through her tears. "And then you trust that someday, someone broken enough to understand will come along and finish what you started." The archive on Velthrix was never silent again. Humans came from all over the galaxy to study the tablets, to learn the grammar of suffering, to read the testimonies of beings who had died 50,000 years before humanity learned to write, and in the central chamber, in a place of honor, they placed the tablet with the child's handprint beneath it. They carved a simple inscription in every human language it read. "This is how we survived."